Good morning, everyone. Today's the Queen's funeral, and I know a lot of people will be watching on television because it's not going to be possible for most people to go to London and actually be in Westminster Abbey or even line the route of the coffin as it goes from Westminster Hall to Westminster Abbey. It's a very short route, so there's not very many people that are going to be allowed to go there. So it's a sad day for a lot of people, of course, because she was on the throne for 70 years. And I know people who watch this channel have got very different opinions about the royal family, so I don't mention them very often. But I think it's good to make a mark of respect on this day. So I will observe the 2 minute silence myself when it happens, as I do on Armistice Day, on the Sunday before November the 11th, because that's a moment in the life of the nation. And I think it's good to do that and to be part of that. But there's something that's interesting. Now, I don't want to make this political at all. I've backed off from talking about politics over the last week and a half, just because I don't particularly think this is the time to do that. I do mention it a little bit when things are important that are going on, but the guest list for the funeral is actually profoundly political, because it was written in a sort of commentary piece, actually, that most or almost all of the leaders of all the countries around the world have been invited to London. And this is going to be the biggest gathering of world leaders that has happened since the beginning of the 19th century, after the Napoleonic Wars. Literally 170, 180 or so world leaders are all going to gather in one place together, which is extraordinary. But there's a small number that haven't been invited. And this is no secret, because there's been a lot of articles about this, and President Putin of Russia is one of the people that hasn't been invited. Now, that is profoundly political, because there are other nations which have done the same as Russia or worse, and are being invited as well. So, for example, Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud is the leader of Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is fighting a genocidal war in Yemen, backed with Western arms. But nobody is mentioning that conflict at all. They haven't mentioned it. It hasn't even got a single mention on mainstream media, as far as I can see, over the last year. Then there is Xi Jinping of China, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, which is coming, and there's a great concern that China is going to invade and annex Taiwan very soon. People are very concerned about that. Now, of course, the situation is nations around the world, including the UK, the US, don't recognize Taiwan as an independent country. But that's only because the Chinese Communist Party, since 1948, has threatened that if we do, they will invade and annex it. So essentially it continues as functioning as an autonomous country, but only while everybody else doesn't recognize it. So it's a very, very precarious situation, and a very unusual situation, to be polite about that. Then we have Justin Trudeau, who Prime Minister of Canada, and at the moment Canada is one of the only countries of the world that still doesn't let its own citizens leave unless they've had an experimental injection, which is pretty tyrannical. And he's been invited. Even in Russia, people are allowed to come and go as they please. And, our leaders and so on say they believe in freedom and democracy, but they're inviting someone who has totally demolished freedom in Canada. And then you've got Jacinda Ardern coming from New Zealand, and she had the same things in place for about 2 years, and and you had very tyrannical crackdowns on freedom protesters for a very long time in New Zealand, and she's been invited to the Queen's funeral and probably will be in Westminster Abbey. So the only countries that haven't been invited are, so as well as Russia, there's Belarus, Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. Even Iran and North Korea have been invited, not on a leadership term, but they've invited the ambassadors of those countries. So they've kind of said, oh, well, you're bad, but you're not so bad as Russia and Afghanistan. When Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, has a horrible tyrannical leadership as well, which had recently has, as far as I can see, killed a couple of women for not wearing a head covering. So, and they've been invited to the funeral. So the list of people who have been invited and haven't been invited, let's just say, okay, I'm not a fan of any of these regimes and so on. You know, in the situation in Russia and Ukraine, you know, what I've said from the beginning is, you know, we got to understand that ethnic Russians in the Donbass have been shelled by National Socialists and killed 14,000 over 8 years. 14,000 civilians have been killed by the Ukraine regime and with National Socialists battalions there. And so, you know, there's much more to the situation, the conflict that you'll find on the Western mainstream media. But, you know, there is very little freedom of speech in Russia if you oppose the conflict. So, you know, it's not a perfect regime at all. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that there is no consistency in how they've applied politics to the guest list, because, you know, if they can invite Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud and Pierre Trudeau, why have they not invited Vladimir Putin? They invite Xi Jinping. Why have they not invited the president of Belarus? So that's just an interesting point, that this is a political statement, if you like, using the Queen's funeral. So when people sort of accuse others of being political at this time over the period of mourning, it's ended up, the period of mourning itself has ended up with a profoundly international political statement. So we have to call out hypocrisy where we see it.